The dirt had a smell to it. Most people never noticed that. They walked over it, built their houses on it, buried their dead in it, and never once stopped to wonder what it was saying. Sloane Cameron had been listening to dirt since they were 9 years old, crouched in a backyard in Halifax with a kitchen spoon and a question nobody around them could answer. What's down there? 31 digs later, 6 continents, 4 cracked ribs, 1 dislocated shoulder, and a scar along the left jaw from a falling stone lintel in a temple outside Chiang Mai that the survey team had specifically marked as stable. The Wayfinder Society had given them a commendation for that one. They'd also given them a lecture about going in ahead of the structural team, which Sloane had listened to with the polite patience of someone who had absolutely no intention of changing their behavior. They were 26 years old. They had dirt under their fingernails that hadn't been entirely clean since they were 12. The Ilios site had been different from the start. Most ruins announced themselves. You'd find pottery shards first, then foundation stones, then the geometry of a place. The way walls had fallen told you how they'd stood. You could read a city like a sentence if you knew the grammar. Ilios knew the grammar and was using it to lie. The upper chamber had given them classical Greek iconography, standard Hellenistic period construction, nothing remarkable. The stone showed the right weathering. The mortar composition matched regional samples from the same era. Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. Sloane had photographed all of it, cataloged it, sent the preliminary report to Wayfinder HQ, and felt the whole time like they were reading the label on a box that contained something else entirely. It was the subsurface imaging that broke the story open. They'd run the ground-penetrating radar on a Thursday morning, which was the same morning 3 Talon operatives arrived at the site in a black utility vehicle with false Wayfinder credentials and the practiced confidence of people who'd done this before. Sloane had looked at the printout from the radar, looked at the vehicle, looked back at the printout, and understood that whatever was in that lower chamber, someone else already knew about it and wanted it badly enough to fake their way in. That had been the end of the polite portion of the afternoon. The fight wasn't long. Sloane had the site geography memorized, and Talon's people didn't, which mattered more than the fact that they were armed, and Sloane was holding a piece of rebar they'd picked up from the supply stack near the east entrance. The smart excavator, the modified boring tool the Ironclad Guild had retrofitted for field use, which had become as natural in Sloane's hands as the kitchen spoon had been at 9, was across the site in the equipment tent. They'd reached it eventually. 2 of the Talon operatives left on their feet, moving fast, and 1 left on a stretcher, because they'd made the mistake of getting between Sloane and their gear. Sloane had stood over the bound 3rd operative and asked one's question, "What are you looking for?" The operative had stared at them with the kind of professional silence that meant they weren't going to answer. But they were very aware of how much trouble they were in. Sloane had said, "I'm going to find it anyway." They'd meant it as a statement of fact. The operative had taken it as a threat, which was fine. Both things were true. That night, alone at the site after the incident report was filed and the Wayfinder security response had come and gone, Sloane sat at the edge of the excavation trench and looked up at the Greek sky. It was very dark out here, and the stars were very bright, and they had the particular quality that ancient things had. The feeling of being watched by something that had seen everything and judged nothing of it. They thought about what a terrorist organization as sophisticated as Talon would want from a ruin in Ilios. They thought about the hidden chamber the imaging had revealed, 40 meters below the current excavation floor, in a layer of substrate that geological analysis dated not to the classical period, but to something roughly 12,000 years older. They thought, that's not a Greek artifact down there. They pulled out their notebook, actual paper, spiral-bound, because field conditions ate through tablets and paper didn't need charging, and wrote 1 line at the top of a fresh page. What happened in this place before humans built anything here? Then they drew a line under it and started making notes. The Shambhali Monastery sat in the high passes of Nepal, in the way that most sacred places sat in the world, deliberately difficult to reach, as though holiness required the approach to be an argument. Sloane had made the argument over 2 days of travel, and arrived with frozen fingertips, and a thermos of coffee that had long since gone cold, and a folder of photographs from Ilios that they spread across the communal table in the reception hall with the air of someone who had rearranged their furniture. The monk who received them was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that had opinions about it, and he looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. Sloane waited. They'd learned patience from fieldwork. Excavation was mostly waiting, waiting for the ground to dry, waiting for the team, waiting for light to fall at the right angle, so the shadows revealed what the direct sun had flattened. They could wait. "You've been to Ilios," the monk said finally, not a question. 3 weeks ago. Talon was there. The monk's expression didn't change, which itself was a change of a kind. "They have been to many places this year, Petra, Ilios. 2 sites in Thailand we know of, and perhaps others we don't. Looking for the same thing?" The monk was quiet again. He picked up one of the photographs, the radar imaging, the echo of the hidden chamber, and held it in both hands as though it were a religious object, which perhaps to him it was. "The artifact you are looking for," he said slowly, "is not Greek. It is not any human culture's artifact. It was placed in that location before humanity developed writing, before your earliest ancestors built structures of any kind. It was placed there by something that understood geology well enough to select a layer of substrate that would keep it stable for a very long time." Sloane watched him. "By something." "Yes, not someone, something." The monk set the photograph down. He looked at Sloane with eyes that were simultaneously very tired and very sharp eyes. "Someone who has spent decades with a truth they couldn't share, and has been waiting for the right person to walk in and make sharing it necessary. Humanity was not the first intelligence to walk on this world, Sloane Cameron. The evidence is scattered across a dozen sites and 100 languages, buried too deep for casual discovery. The Wayfinder Society has been collecting fragments of this evidence for a very long time. Most of our members never learn the full picture. But you're telling me, because Talon has learned, and if they recover the artifact before we understand it, whatever purpose it was designed to serve, they will determine that purpose. That seems unwise." Sloane picked up their notebook and a pen. They said, "Tell me everything." The monk's name was Brother Atesh, and he talked for 6 hours. He talked about the precursor theory, the Wayfinder Society's oldest and most closely held hypothesis, suppressed from academic publication because the supporting evidence was so strange and so fragmentary that releasing it prematurely would destroy the organization's credibility before the picture was complete. He talked about 17 sites on 4 continents where identical geometric patterns had been found in geological strata predating human civilization by margins measured in millennia. He talked about artifacts recovered from those sites. Objects that defied conventional material analysis, that registered no known alloy composition, that survived conditions that should have destroyed them, and that occasionally, when subjected to specific harmonic frequencies, emitted signals in spectra that human instrumentation could detect, but not decode. He talked about what the Wayfinder Society's cryptography team, quietly over 30 years of work, without publishing, had come to believe those signals said. The artifacts were a network. Not a passive network, not a monument or a library, but something closer to a distributed system. Pieces of something larger, scattered across the planet with the care of someone who knew they would not be collected for a very long time, and needed them to survive the wait. And the artifact in the chamber below Ilios, the one Talon had been looking for and had not yet found, was the node that connected them, the keystone, the piece without which the others were just objects. Sloane sat with that for a moment. "Who built them?" they asked. "That," Brother Atish said, "is the question. You have a theory. We have evidence. Evidence that something left this world long ago and left these objects behind as, we believe, a message, or a test, or boast, or a door. A door to what?" The old monk looked at them with those sharp, tired eyes. "We don't know. But Talon does not strike me as an organization that would ask that question before walking through." Sloane looked at their notes for a long time. Outside the monastery windows, the Himalayan night was absolute and cold, the kind of cold that was philosophical in its completeness. They thought about the radar image. They thought about the thing at the bottom of 40 meters of carefully selected geological strata placed by hands, or something like hands, that had been dust for longer than humanity had been a species. They thought about the half-smile they got every single time when a shovel first broke ground, the same feeling they'd had at 9 in that Halifax backyard. "What's down there?" "Where?" Sloane said, capping their pen. "Did Talon take their people after Ilios?" The answer, it turned out, was not far. Talon had a facility. Calling it a base felt too generous and too specific. It was more like a repurposed industrial complex on an island in the Aegean that showed up on satellite maps as a disused shipping logistics center. And they had not been especially subtle about their recent movements because they had not expected anyone to be following the trail. The breadcrumbs were there for anyone who knew what crumbs to look for. Old permits, new patterns of vehicular access, power consumption anomalies that suggested heavy equipment running underground. Sloan spent 4 days in the Shambhala library, cross-referencing Brother Aish's materials with their own field notes, and the satellite data the Wayfinders Society's intelligence contact could access without asking too many official questions. They ate whatever was put in front of them. They slept 4 or 5 hours a night, more from biological necessity than desire. They filled 14 pages of their notebook with diagrams and timelines and, in the margins, with a running argument they were having with themselves about probability. On the 5th morning they packed their kit, strapped the smart excavator across their back, and told Brother Atesh they were going to get the artifact back. The monk had looked at them, this 26-year-old with dirt permanently under their nails and a scar along their jaw and the specific energy of someone who found the universe personally interesting and slightly rude, and said, "You're going alone?" "I'm better underground than a team is," Sloan had said, "and I don't want anyone else's accident on my ledger." That was partly true. The other part was that they didn't want anyone else slowing down the part that happened before thinking, which was the part they were best at. The island smelled of salt and diesel and the particular industrial mineral odor of a place where heavy machinery had been running in enclosed spaces for too long. Sloan came in from the water, which was cold even by Greek island standards in April, and they spent the first 20 minutes on the rocks below the complex's eastern face just listening. Sound traveled well through structures if you knew how to hear it. Ventilation patterns, foot traffic rhythms, the low harmonic of equipment running on a specific power load. They heard at least a dozen people, 3 distinct mechanical systems running, and, this was the thing, a 4th frequency that didn't belong to any mechanical system they could identify. That 4th frequency was not quite a sound. It was more like the feeling of a sound. The way you could feel bass through a floor without hearing it as a distinct note. It came from below, and it was not rhythmic, and it was not steady. It rose and fell in patterns that, if Sloan had been pressed to describe them, they would have said felt almost like breathing. Something in the hidden chamber had woken up. That changed the math considerably. Sloan had planned for a recovery operation, find the artifact, extract it before Talon fully understood what they had, get out. What they had not planned for was the artifact being active. An active artifact meant the network was responding. A responding network meant time had become a different kind of factor. They pressed themselves against the rock face, pulled out the notebook, found an empty margin, and spent about 45 seconds doing the kind of thinking that most people would call reckless, and that Sloan would call efficient. Then they shouldered the excavator, and found the place where the rock face met the foundation of the complex, and began very quietly to dig. Going underground was for Sloan the most natural thing in the world. Better than standing in line, better than most social situations. The soil told you things. Composition, moisture content, age, what had been here before. You could read a place's history in cross-section. You could understand time by moving through it vertically. The excavator's burrowing function was designed for field excavation, but worked fine for this. The modified boring head was near silent when operated at low power, and the substrate here was limestone over older basalt. Good news, structurally stable, no risk of collapse at the depth they needed to reach. Sloan moved through the rock with the focused efficiency of someone doing something they'd done 10,000 times, which in a sense they had. And they did not think about what they'd find at the bottom. Because thinking about what you'd find was how you stopped paying attention to where you were. They surfaced in darkness. The chamber below the Talon complex was vast. Their helmet light caught the ceiling at about 12 meters, and the walls were further than the beam reached. The walls were wrong. Not wrong in a damaged way, not wrong in a structurally unsound way, but wrong in the way that something hand-fashioned looks different from something machine-made. And this was neither. The surfaces had a quality of deliberateness that was extraordinary. Not carved, not poured, not assembled from smaller pieces, but shaped in a single gesture by something that had wanted them exactly this way and had achieved it. The geometry was not random. The angles were not angles that human hands tended to produce. And at the center of the chamber, the artifact, Sloan had expected something small. The Ilios imaging had suggested a contained volume, something the size of a crate. What sat at the center of the chamber, suspended above the floor by nothing visible, rotating very slowly on an axis that seemed to shift as you watched it, was closer to the size of a car. It was not the size it had been when it was buried. It had grown. It was the color of deep water, or it was the color of space, Or it was the color of the inside of a geode, which was to say it was all three colors simultaneously, depending on angle and light. And it was emitting the frequency that Sloane had felt from outside the rock face. And now that they were standing 3 meters from it, they realized the frequency was not like breathing. It was exactly like breathing. They stood there for a moment, with their helmet light on, and the excavator in their hands, and the notebook in their chest pocket, and they had the feeling they'd had, the first time they'd found something that mattered underground. The specific, irreplaceable feeling of a mystery making eye contact with you. Then the chamber lights came on. There were 9 of them. Talon field operatives, armored in the flat mat equipment of people who prepared for professional violence and didn't want it mistaken for anything else. Their leader was a woman who stood at the head of the formation, with the patience of someone accustomed to winning situations by weight of numbers, which was reasonable because she usually was. Sloane Cameron, she said. The voice was calm, European accent, German perhaps, or Austrian. The Wayfinders sent their excavation specialist. The Wayfinders sent me, Sloane agreed, which was true in the technical sense that they'd left from a Wayfinder facility and the Wayfinders had not been able to stop them. What are you doing with it? Learning from it. The woman glanced at the artifact. It wants to be activated. It's been trying to activate for 12,000 years. We're going to help it. You don't know what it does. We will, once it does it. She said this with a kind of corporate confidence that was somehow more chilling than theatrics would have been. Sloane shifted their weight slightly, which moved them half a step closer to the artifact and repositioned the excavator in their grip, without making the repositioning look like anything other than restlessness. They glanced around the chamber. The Talon team was in a semicircle. 3 were positioned between them and the exit tunnel. The artifact was rotating slightly faster now. They'd noticed that the moment the lights came on, as though the artifact was also paying attention. It didn't originate here, Sloane said. They were talking partly to keep the conversation moving, and partly because they genuinely wanted an answer. The site at Ilios was a containment structure. Someone put this here deliberately. That suggests whoever built it knew something about what it does and decided it needed to be contained. The woman's expression shifted slightly. You've been to the Shambali. The Wayfinder Society has been sitting on this information for 30 years while the object has been trying to wake up. We're not interested in containment. We're interested in what comes next. And if what comes next is bad, progress, she said, is rarely comfortable. It was, Sloane thought, a very specific kind of human arrogance. The assumption that because you had the power to open a thing, you had the right to, and the wisdom to survive it. The same assumption that had dropped mountains of tailings into river systems and split atoms in test sites in the American desert and done 10,000 other things to the world. Because the doing was interesting, and the consequence were somebody else's problem in a future that didn't exist yet. The artifact pulsed. Once, hard, the frequency hit Sloane in the sternum like a fist. And then it spoke, not in words, not in any acoustic sense, but something transferred. A package of meaning, compressed and precise, dropped into Sloane's understanding the way a stone dropped into water, and the ripples were comprehension. They felt it land. And they understood it, and the understanding was so strange and so complete that for 2 seconds they just stood there with their mouth slightly open and the smart excavator at their side. The Talon operatives were reacting to something too. 3 of them had stepped back. The leader had gone very still. The artifact had spoken to everyone in the room. But the message was different for Sloane. They could feel that it was different. It had identified something. Not their name, not their face, but something about the way they engaged with the world, the quality of their curiosity, the specific texture of the attention they brought to underground spaces. And it had said, in a compressed burst of meaning that would have taken hours to fully unpack, yes. You, hold on. That was not, Sloane thought with a clarity that surprised them, a welcome. It was an instruction. They moved. The drill-dash function of the excavator was designed for field work, for breaking through dense substrate at speed, for creating passage where none existed. Applied at close quarters to a semicircle of armed Talon operatives, it was devastatingly effective at clearing a path through the formation. Sloane hit the first 2 before anyone had fully reacted, used the momentum to carry through to the third, dropped and rolled through the gap, and came up near the artifact. It was warm. From 3 feet away, it was warm in a way that stone and metal were not warm. A warmth that was not thermal, that came from something other than energy exchange. Like the warmth of a hand. Behind them, the Talon team was reorganizing. They had about 4 seconds. Sloan did what they had always done when they found something that mattered. They reached out and they touched it. The world did not end. The chamber did not explode. The artifact did not tear a hole in space-time, activate a weapon, summon an army, or do any of the dramatic things that Talon had presumably been hoping for or were afraid of. What it did was much quieter, and Sloan thought much more important. It showed them something. A memory, not a human memory, nothing shaped by human neurology or human time, but a record. The record of a departure. Something that had been here on this world, for a period of time that the human brain couldn't hold as a number, and could only approximate as very long. Something that had walked this ground and swum in these seas, and found this planet worth caring about, had left. Not died, left. Had distributed pieces of itself across the planet. Not as technology, not as tools, but as listening posts, as letters, as the equivalent of leaving a light on in a window for someone who might come home eventually, or might not, and had set the network to wait for the right touch. Not a particular species, not a particular moment for a particular quality of attention, the same quality of curiosity and care that found things, and then tried to understand them rather than just use them. The artifact showed Sloan 12,000 years of waiting. Then it folded itself down to a size they could carry in one hand and went quiet. The 4 seconds had passed. Sloan spun, caught the first operative's weapon arm at the wrist, and redirected it upward. Took 2 steps back toward the exit tunnel and fired the excavator's seismic charge at the floor between themselves and the Talon formation. The charge detonated in the substrate, sending a shockwave through the chamber floor that knocked 4 of them off their feet. The chamber lighting flickered. The leader was still standing. She looked at Sloan's closed fist and what it contained, and she looked at Sloan's face, and she understood in the way that experienced people understood difficult situations that this particular exchange was over. "You have no idea what you're holding," she said. "I have a pretty good idea," Sloan said. They were backing toward the tunnel they'd come in through, and I think whoever left it had a pretty good idea what they were doing when they chose not to give it to people like Talon. "People like us? We're the ones who found it." "You found the box," Sloan said. "You didn't know what was in it. Finding the box doesn't mean it's yours." That seemed to genuinely irritate her, which was fine. Irritated people made suboptimal decisions, and Sloan needed about 30 seconds of suboptimal decisions to make the exit tunnel without getting shot. They got 22 seconds, which was enough. The excavator's burrowing function worked just as well going up as going down, and Sloan moved through the limestone with the specific efficiency of panic organized into competence. Behind them, they could hear the Talon team hitting the tunnel entrance, could hear equipment being brought to bear on the rock face, could feel through the stone the vibration of people who were angry and armed, and had just lost something they'd spent significant resources pursuing. They surfaced on the cliff face above the waterline. The Greek night was cold, and the sea below was black, and the stars were exactly as they'd been over the Ilios site, ancient and vast, and offering no particular opinion about the last hour's events. Sloan sat with their back against the rock and the artifact in their closed fist, and their heart rate at something significantly above normal, and they laughed. Not from relief, exactly, and not from triumph, but from the particular joy that lived at the intersection of fear and wonder, and the moment when a mystery resolves itself not into an answer but into a better question. The artifact pulsed once in their palm. Very gently they thought, "I know, hold on." Then they found their notebook, uncapped their pen, and started writing. The debriefing at Wayfinder HQ lasted 3 days, and was the most productive argument Sloan had ever been in. The artifact sat on the conference table in the secure analysis room, and did not pulse or glow, or emit anything detectable by any instrument the Wayfinder's laboratory had, which was either because it was inactive or because it chose not to be detected. And Sloan had their own opinion about which. Brother Atesh had come from Nepal, and sat at the corner of the table and mostly listened, though occasionally he confirmed details from the Wayfinder Society's 3 decades of suppressed research that Sloan's field findings matched with uncomfortable precision. The argument was about what to do next. The conservative faction, which was most of the Society's senior membership, wanted the artifact recontained, placed somewhere more secure than Ilios, studied from a distance, the network mapped but not activated, the whole thing treated as a long-term project, requiring consensus and institutional support, and approximately 1 more generation of careful scholarship. Sloan sat through their arguments with the patience of someone who understood and respected caution as a professional disposition, and disagreed with it as a conclusion. When it was their turn to speak, they didn't start with the technical data, or the network topology, or the geological evidence, or any of the other materials spread across the conference table. They started with the airport in Athens, where they'd stopped for 8 hours on the way back, and the man who'd sat next to them in the departure lounge with his wife and his 2 children, all of them clearly exhausted from travel, clearly happy, the children asleep across their parents' laps in the awkward configurations that children achieved in public spaces. They'd looked at that family and thought about the 12,000 years of waiting the artifact had shown them, and about what Talon had wanted to do with it, and about the particular human quality that the artifact had responded to, which was not the human quality of power or ambition or technological achievement, but something smaller and more durable, the desire to understand, and the patience to wait for understanding rather than assuming it. Whatever built that network, Sloan said, didn't leave it for the first intelligence to find it. They left it for the right intelligence. The intelligence that would ask what it was before deciding what to do with it. They looked around the table. We're asking. Talon wasn't asking. I think that's the whole test. Silence in the conference room. Brother Atesh smiled very slightly at his corner of the table. And if we're wrong? One of the senior members asked. If activating the network does something we don't understand and can't control, then we'll figure it out, Sloan said. That's what we do. We're human. We go somewhere we don't understand, and we come back with better questions than we left with. They paused, usually covered in dirt and slightly banged up. But we come back. The decision took another 2 days of argument, and no consensus, which Sloan had expected. And so on the morning of the 3rd day they had done what they always did when institutions moved too slowly for the pace of the problem. They'd gotten up early, packed their kit, told Brother Atesh where they were going, and left. The network, as the Wayfinder Society's 3 decades of research had mapped it, had 16 nodes across 4 continents. Sloan had identified the activation sequence from the memory the artifact had transferred. Not a code, not a password, but a specific spatial pattern of engagement. The same quality of curious and careful attention repeated at each location. The keystone, which Sloan carried in the inside pocket of their field jacket, would do the rest. They started in Petra. Petra at dawn was a color that didn't have a name in any language Sloan knew. The light hit the rose sandstone walls and bounced through the canyon architecture in a way that made the whole city feel lit from within. They'd been here before, years ago, as a junior apprentice carrying survey equipment for a senior wayfinder who'd told them the upper chambers were thoroughly mapped, and there was nothing left to find. That senior wayfinder had been wrong, which was fine. Most senior people who said there was nothing left to find were wrong. That was how the world worked. The unexplored portions were always bigger than the explored ones, and the explored ones were always less understood than they seemed. The Petra node was in a chamber below the treasury that no current survey had mapped, because no current survey had asked the right questions of the substrate. Sloan had asked the right questions with the excavator, and was underground within 20 minutes of arriving. The node here was a fragment, a piece of the network, a disk of the same material as the artifact, the same deep water space geode color, set into the rock face at a particular angle and depth. Sloan's touched it. The artifact in their pocket pulsed. The disk hummed very briefly. 1. Thailand. Site 4 outside Chiang Mai, the same region as the temple with the unstable lintel. This node was deeper than Petra, 80 meters below the surface, in a layer of substrate that dated to before the last ice age. Sloan went down in stages, checking stability as they went, taking their time. Rushed excavation was how you died in places like this, or at minimum how you triggered collapses that required extended rescue operations and paperwork. The node here had a different shape, not a disk but something closer to a helix, wound through the rock in a way that was anatomically wrong for any geological process but geometrically coherent with the network's overall design. When Sloan touched it, the transfer was stronger than Petra had been. Not words, not images exactly. The impression of vast distance. The impression of something that had been patient, in ways that made 12,000 years feel local. 2. Ilios again, back to the beginning. The upper site was roped off now. Incident markers, from the Talon encounter, still in place. A Wayfinder security team that Sloan nodded to on the way past, as though they had every right to be there, which they did, roughly speaking. The lower chamber was intact. Whatever had been here before the artifact was removed was still here. The geometry of the walls, the deliberate angles, the shape of the space that had been designed to hold something specific. The node wasn't a physical object. The node was the chamber itself. The shape of it was the message, the specific proportions encoding a frequency that the artifact responded to when brought into proximity. Sloan stood in the center of the space and held the artifact in both hands, and the chamber sang. 3. They moved through the network over 12 days. Each site was different, buried deep or shallow, in deserts or mountains or coastal rock, always placed with the same quality of care, always oriented toward the same invisible center point that triangulated, when Sloan mapped it, to a location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. None of the sites had been compromised by Talon. Either Talon hadn't found them, or Talon had known something that Sloan was only now understanding. The nodes weren't accessible to everyone. You had to come to them a specific way. By the 10th site, Sloan understood the pattern well enough to feel it. The quality of attention the network required wasn't some mystical trait reserved for special individuals. It was available to anyone willing to come to a thing with genuine curiosity and no agenda beyond understanding it. The nodes were not locked to a species or a bloodline or a level of technological achievement. They were locked to an approach. Come to us wanting to know us and we'll show you. The 12th, 13th, and 14th sites went quickly. Sloan had the pattern by now and moved through the activation protocol with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced a skill past the point of conscious effort. The excavator barely needed to work. The nodes recognized the artifact recognized the nodes, and the exchange was clean and fast. At the 15th site, an undersea location off the coast of Nova Scotia, which struck Sloan as either a cosmic coincidence or a very specific choice by whatever had designed the network. They sat for a long time in their dive gear on the seafloor before touching the node. Nova Scotia. They'd grown up 40 kilometers from here, had done their first unauthorized excavation in a backyard in Halifax, had dug up most of a foundation from the 1800s that turned out to belong to a house that had been demolished before their parents were born, and had spent an afternoon with that foundation in a state of complete joy. The ocean floor was dark and cold and immense. Sloan sat in it with a 12,000-year-old alien artifact in their hand and thought about the boy whose job it had been to water the neighbor's garden, and the fact that the garden had that particularly interesting-looking patch of disturbed soil near the old stone wall. What's down there? They touched the node. 15. The final location was the one the triangulation pointed to, the open Pacific, which from a surface perspective was just ocean, which was fine because the node wasn't at the surface. It was 400 meters down, which was deep but not extreme for modern equipment. And the Wayfinder Society had a research vessel that they'd sent. By the time Sloan reached the 15th site, the Society's senior council had apparently decided that unanimous consensus was no longer the operative requirement and had voted narrowly to support the operation. Brother Atesh had sent a message through Wayfinder channels that read in full, the vote was 11-9. The 9 are not wrong, just slow. Be careful. 400 meters. The pressure at that depth was 40 times surface pressure, which meant the suit Sloan wore was not the field kit they'd carried to Ilios and Petra and Chiang Mai, but something considerably more engineered. It was also considerably less comfortable. The descent took 40 minutes in the vehicle. The seafloor here was basalt, old basalt, the kind that had been on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. The 16th node was there, larger than any of the others. Not a fragment, but something complete. The same material as the artifact, but the size of a building, or what would have been the size of a building if it had any geometry that a building could be said to have. It was also active. Whatever Sloan's activation of the other 15 nodes had done had come here first, or simultaneously, or the network didn't work in sequences the way human systems did. The node was lit. The deep-water space geode color was coming from it in waves, blue and gold, and something that the human visual system registered as color without being able to name. Sloan approached it. The artifact in their hand was warm. The warmth had been building for the last 5 sites, a slow accumulation, like something returning to temperature after a long cold storage. They put their hand against the surface of the node. The transfer was not like the others. What came through was not a memory. It was not an instruction. It was something closer to a conversation. The first word of a conversation that had been 12,000 years in the setup. Delayed not because the other party had been inattentive, but because they had been waiting for the right moment, which was the moment of genuine contact rather than extraction or appropriation, or any of the other things that intelligent species tended to do with things they found and didn't understand. What came through said, in meaning rather than language, "We've been watching. Not you, specifically. Your species, watching the way you come to things. Watching you argue with yourselves about what is right, and what is useful, and what is allowed. Watching you make mistakes and sometimes learn from them, and sometimes not. Watching you reach into the dark for things you can't see. We left because we had to. We leave something of ourselves, wherever we have been. Because, to be somewhere and then leave without a trace seems wrong to us. This world was ours for a long time, now it is yours. The network was our way of saying, when you are ready to know us, touch it. You touched it in the right way. That seemed like enough to start. Sloan held on to the surface of the node and let the transfer continue. There was no telling how long it took. Time did something complicated at 400 meters underwater in the middle of the Pacific. Or perhaps time did something complicated when a species made contact with the record of another species for the first time. Or perhaps Sloan simply stopped tracking it because tracking time was not what the moment required. What the moment required was the same thing every moment of discovery required, to be entirely present in it, without rushing toward the conclusion, without performing an understanding they didn't yet have, without anything except attention. They had always been good at that. The ascent took 40 minutes. The research vessel was waiting. Brother Acha was on it. He'd come from Kathmandu in 3 days, which for a man his age was either impressive or inadvisable, probably both. Sloan came up through the moon pool and stood on the deck of the vessel in the Pacific afternoon sun and dripped seawater on the non-slip surface, and the monk looked at them with the sharp, tired eyes. Well, he said. Sloan stood there for a moment. The artifact was in their hand, and it was warm, and it was the deep water space geode color, and it was not rotating or pulsing or doing anything dramatic. It was just there exactly what it was. A piece of something very old and very far away that had wanted, more than anything, to be correctly understood. We're not alone, Sloan said. No, the monk agreed. We never were. They left because they needed to. They're not coming back, not soon. Maybe not in our lifetime. Maybe not for a long time. Sloan looked at the artifact. But they left this so that when we found it and asked the right questions, we'd have somewhere to start. And what do we do with that? Sloan thought about the family in the Athens airport, about the children asleep across their parents' laps, about 12,000 years of a light left on in a window, about 9 votes that were not wrong, just slow. We tell the truth, they said. We write it down. We publish the data and the methodology, and all 30 years of the society's suppressed research, and we let the world argue about it because that's what humans do, and it's how we get better answers. They looked up at the monk. And we keep digging, because there's more down there. There's always more. Brother Atesh was quiet for a moment. Then he said slowly, 11 to 9, I know. Sloan almost smiled. Tell the 9 I said thank you. They're why we took our time. They pocketed the artifact and went below decks to find something to eat, and a spiral-bound notebook with some empty pages left. Because the questions that needed writing down were not going to wait. And writing them down before they faded was always the first step. What's down? The answer, it turned out, was everything. They picked up the pen.